So my name is Jamin Warren. I am the founder and CEO of Killscreen, a video game arts and culture company. I started my career as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. At the time the Journal had hired me, they were looking for like a young guy reporter, like what are the kids up to? What is this Facebook thing? And I was the first person to write about the changes in Facebook when people. It's funny looking back. I wrote about how Facebook was changing the news feed and people just flipped out. And then Facebook kept changing it like every 6 months, and people kept flipping out. So that was my job, was to figure out put my finger to the pulse of culture and bring things back to the public. So I, like most journalists, I was really interested in finding a niche for myself. One of the big challenges for being a journalist is you cover a lot of different things, and so I wanted to have something that I could define as just me. So there's two things that I've done my entire life. One is read, and the other one is play video games. So I thought, all right, this will be great. I'm going to be the video games guy at the Wall Street Journal. This is wonderful, great opportunity. I've loved games my entire life. So I started writing about games, and I discovered two things very, very quickly. One was that the Journal was not particularly interested in having me write about video games. Perhaps that's not too surprising. They've changed a lot over the last couple of years since I've left there. But that approach was emblematic of the way a lot of large media institutions treated games. I had mentioned this example earlier. If you go to any of your favorite outlets, newspapers, et cetera, and look at games, they're almost never italicized and are never put in quotes. And so that format distinction really, for me, is emblematic of how they think about games. It's a product. It's something that comes out of an ether. It's not art. It's not high culture. The other thing that I discovered was that a lot of the content that was geared towards people who play games was targeted at bros, I guess, right? So it's college kids, students, but if you were over the age of, let's say, 21, and you were interested in the intersection of games and art, music, design, all of those other things, there wasn't a lot out there. So I felt like, you know what, this is a great opportunity to start thinking more highly about how video games work, because I feel like there's a mission out there to explain what games are. There's a great essay written by Chuck Klosterman for Esquire magazine, and he asked this question about why is there no Lester Bangs of video games? This is Lester Bangs, who's a music critic from the 70s and 80s. He was in that film Almost Famous. He's kind of amused in the film. But the idea that Chuck Klosterman gets at is that the lack of critics was because video game criticism can't evolve because video game criticism couldn't get started. He talks about writing about video games as he calls them potentiality critics, because what critics do is they don't just analyze the thing that's happening, but they point towards its future. There's some sort of end that they're directing people towards. And he felt like, well, there's nothing like that for games, so how do we move into the next century? So I thought, great. That's a great opportunity for me. So let me explain Killscreen a little bit, and then we'll get into kind of the story-based portion of the talk. As mentioned, we're a video game arts and culture company. Our motto is we're asking the question of what do video games mean for those who play games and for those who make them. We started with a bunch of writers such as myself. We pulled in writers from GQ, Esquire, New Yorker to start writing about games, relaunched our website. One of the things we're really proud of is our partnerships with other institutions. We kind of think of it as our job to put games in places where they aren't normally found. So we've had the opportunity of working with the Lincoln Center in the past, with the new museum. We have a partnership with Pitchfork, who's a hometown Chicago entity, as well as last year we did a one-night arcade for the Museum of Modern Art, bringing more than 1,000 people to play games on 3 different floors. And I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So my attraction to games was really about developing stories through narrative, through design, through experience, because story is at the heart of everything that I do. I think the big problem with video games is that they lack a vernacular, a native tongue for all people who play games that they can converse in openly. And this lack of common narrative culture, it really frightens me, because we're moving out of a world where people ask, are you a gamer? And we're moving into a world where people ask, what games do you play? So let's talk a little bit more about, so there's two things I want to get at about why I was attracted to games. The first one was that games allow us to write our own stories. So, it's interesting, as a reporter, people have a really, really hard time telling their own stories. I used to interview a lot of musicians and athletes and all these different people who had these really exciting lives. They're jet-setting around the world, and I asked them, well, why do you do that? And they're kind of like, I don't know. I mean, it just kind of comes to me naturally. And that was my job as a reporter. So the people with the most exciting lives in the world really lack the faculties to tell those stories themselves, which is good because that gave me a job, at least for the time being. So one of my favorite writers is a guy named Tom Bissell. And he talks about, he wrote this great book called Extra Lives. I encourage all of you to read it. And one of the things that he talks about is that how games are powerful is that they allow us to author experiences. And he writes, so what have games given me? Experiences, not surrogate experiences, but actual experiences, many of which are as important to me as any real memory. So what does that actually mean? I will use a game as an example. This is a screenshot from a game called Heavy Rain. It is a David Lynch-style neo-noir thriller set in Philadelphia. It rains there all the time for some reason. I'm from Philadelphia, but I think it was just like a setting decision on the part of the designers. In any case, you play as 4 different characters, one of whom is an architect named Ethan. I think it's the first time an architect has ever been the protagonist for a video game, as far as I know. There's actually one activity where you're like at your sketchboard and it's like move the thumbstick up and you draw this big sweeping line, and it makes you feel very majestic and like you're in a car commercial or something. So Ethan goes to the mall with his son at the very beginning of the game. He has 2 sons, and his son is holding a red balloon. And you turn around, Ethan, and his son is gone. So you spend 5 minutes scrambling through the mall, just yelling, Jason, Jason, Jason. I'm not a father. I don't have any kids. But that moment of panic, that moment of realization that your child is gone and missing, that's a real experience. That resonates with me just as a human being. And that's something that games really have the ability to do, is that's a real experience for me that I get to carry with other people. So the other thing about games is that they really tell about ourselves. I think there's a misperception about games that by playing games, we're somehow becoming these other people, and that games are not connected at all to who we are as human beings. I think you see this a lot in nature. So I have this argument that games are pre-verbal, right? That games are part of this longer history of play, and that you see that in nature. So lion cubs play with their parents because that's what prepares them for later life. Monkeys play, they play as a way to escape from said lions. But really, this idea that play is connected deeply to who we are as human beings. I heard a great story about a young man who's going to marry a girl from Hong Kong. And the idea was that by marrying this girl from Hong Kong, he wasn't going to be able to speak to his father-in-law because they don't speak the same language. So they decided that they would play mahjong together. And the idea was that by playing mahjong, he would get a better understanding of who this man was, even though they couldn't communicate in the same language. So was he vindictive? Was he a risk taker? Was he someone who was he a risk taker? Is he someone who understood the rules of the game? Was he a cheater? These are all things that games could tell us, even if they couldn't communicate in the same language. I think because people are bad at telling stories about themselves, games can serve as a really, really good proxy. And those conversations have a lot of meaning. I gave a talk about a year and a half ago to some students in New Haven, Connecticut, many of whom had developmental disabilities. It was a feeder school for kids who had been pulled out of the school system, and then they were being retrained to be reacclimated. And so we were talking about games, because that's what I do and that's what I talk about. And Call of Duty came up. Now, I'm not saying that students of that age, 12, 13, 14, should be playing Call of Duty, so please don't mistake me there. But they were, so we decided to talk about it. And it was really interesting, the conversation that I was having with them. One of the students played as a sniper class, and the other one played as an artillery class. And they're having this conversation back and forth. The sniper guy's like, I hate it how you're just running around down there. It's really frustrating for me to hit you. And the artillery guy's like, I hate that you just camp out in one spot. So I asked them, well, where does this conception, it's war, right? So where does this conception of fairness, justice, where does that come from? They've never been in a wartime setting, but they have very firm opinions about what is just war. And so what they're actually having is a conversation. That's how the Geneva Convention gets started, right? Is that these kids, writ small, are having a conversation about morality, about ethics, that reflects their own personal disposition, reflects their own personal beliefs as well. I think video games are an incredibly powerful medium. So let's move on. So how do games tell stories? So my attraction to games, that they tell these great stories. So how do they go about doing that? One of the big problems with games is something I'd like to call the dinner table problem. The big issue, for those of you who play games, let's say you're at dinner, and the Oscars are this Sunday, right? So if you bring up the Oscars, everyone's going to have an opinion about the Oscars. What are people going to wear? There's all this pageantry and dialogue about the Oscars. You talk about games at dinner, people aren't going to pay attention to you, right? Unless you've played Angry Birds together and you can kind of sequester yourselves about how to beat level 217. But those are rare. For the most part, if you haven't played a game with another person, we really have a hard time describing those experiences to other people. I really think the big problem is that people just actively don't talk about games. And that's what's holding games back, is an inability for people to tell stories through them. So let's stop thinking about games as like entertainment or art, and let's think about them from another perspective. Let's think about them as physical objects. So that's something all of you have computers, laptops, all those sorts of things. Objects are part of our everyday lives. There's a great book by a guy named Harvey Mollich. He's a professor at NYU of anthropology. And he wrote this great book called Where Stuff Comes From. And he talks a lot at the beginning about the toaster, right? So a toaster is an everyday object. Most of you have toasters, I think. I don't think anyone microwaves their bread. That's probably not good. But he talks about the toasters, specifically the difference between like American toasters and European toasters. American toasters have this like pop-up mechanism. European toasters have this kind of pull-out, this kind of like toaster oven sort of thing. But his point is that goods provide a basis in a number of different ways, including their use for there to be some sense of social reality. And what he calls this is lash-up, right? So if you look at physical objects, they all are embedded with these stories. Mollich is really arguing for a deeper understanding of object culture. So he says, if you want to really understand like design, and by design I also mean games, then you need to think about them from their component parts. So if games are goods, then how do they tell stories? There's a term that's been going around lately. It's called affinity commerce. Affinity commerce refers to this idea, explanations, people want explanations for why do you drive out of the way to get those pickles from that stand that you love, or why you have all different ways to engage in commerce in a variety of different ways. You can go to McDonald's, you can go to Walmart, et cetera. But recently there's been a lot more discussions about artisanal cheeses and craft goods and sites like Etsy. So why does that come about? Well, I think the idea is that objects have stories. People want to know where things come from, and they want to know how they've been delivered. One of my favorite examples, as someone who drinks beer, and recently as someone who's started brewing beer, this comes from a Scottish brewery called Brewdog. They're a cheeky brewer, so to speak. So this is a beer that they brewed. It was called The End of History. And the idea was it's named after Francis Fukuyama's essay of the same term. It's more than $600 a bottle. They only made 24 of them. It's 50% alcohol. So why would you make something like this, right? I've seen one. It's in Copenhagen. It felt like a magical moment, right? And I don't have that experience when I look at beer bottles, but with this one, I certainly did. So on the one hand, you could just say this is just crass marketing. They're just trying to get attention. But really what I think this brewer understands is to stand out in the marketplace. They want to create objects that people are going to tell stories about. That they want something that when it sits on your shelf long after the contents have been emptied, you can say, that was a thing that I have, and it's really powerful and important to me. Kickstarter, how many of you are familiar with Kickstarter? Awesome, that's great. So we actually got our start on Kickstarter. Kickstarter, for those of you who don't know, is a crowdfunding platform. You put up a creative project, and then people decide if they would like to fund it. If it doesn't reach its fundraising goal, you get your money back. So it's kind of like an airline catalog for things that don't exist yet. And so what's powerful about Kickstarter is it allows creators to tell stories, and that's what gives them value, because the things don't actually exist, right? All you have is the creator's stories, basically, to go on. So why does this work? Well, I think it works because it makes meaningful connections between creators and their creation. And so what does this have to do with games? Well, I think one of the big problems with games is that, and Mollich argues this about design, that if I was to ask you, who is maybe people know, some folks know, the lead design chief for Apple, right? Most people wouldn't know, or who Dieter Rams is, for example. There are all these design objects we have in their life, but we don't assign any kind of authorial attention to them. And that's something that happens with games. So when we start thinking about games as something that are authored, then when they have an author, we start appreciating them on a higher level. So we start to think about things about history, location. Jim had pointed out those museums are actually very bad about this, in that you're able to identify particular painters, but you really don't get a lot of context for how and why paintings were created. Modigliani, for example, had astigmatism, and part of the reason for his abstraction is because he was literally just painting what he saw, right? But if you don't know that, your understanding of the painting is going to be very, very different. So what games do stories tell? I should be very clear that it should be really clear that story works very differently in games. I'll talk about that in a second. So I'm not specifically talking about the plot line that stories tell. I think Henry Jenkins has a great quote about games and story. He says that if some games tell stories, they are unlikely to tell them in the same ways that other media tell stories. Stories are not empty content that can be ported from one media pipeline to another. So how do games tell stories? And this is sort of the meat of the talk. What I'm hoping that you walk away from is a deeper understanding. Is like when you look at a game, to give you some framework and say, oh, here are different ways that I can evaluate that. Here are ways I can think about that, and I can talk about it with other people. This comes from, this is an illustration from a book by Michael Nitsch, who's a professor at Georgia Tech. He's really interested in game spaces. And what his argument is that one of the things that happens that's really unique to games is that you're in all these different places at the same time, right? So you think about reading a book, for example. Reading a book, pretty static experience for the most part. Let's say let's just reading a physical book object, not reading a Kindle or something like that. So maybe there's the fiction that you're reading. Maybe the space that you're reading it might be important if you're on a train. I tend to zone out, so that's not as important to me. It's not a very social experience unless you're reading it out loud to kids. For the most part, books don't really interact on the same level. Games trigger all of these different senses. So I'm going to return to this a couple times. And so here's what I'm going to do. I think it's a great framework to understand how we should talk about games and how we can tell stories about games. And I'm going to tie some things to games, and we'll pull it back a little bit. So we're going to start with at the bottom right there, the set of rules. So I've been trying to teach my girlfriend about football. She's never watched football before in her entire life. And I think, whenever you teach somebody something that you understand really well, I came from a football family. My brother was a halfback at UNC. My dad played football in college. I've been watching football my entire life. I quit football to join the debate team, so I guess I'm my mom was in the band, so I come from a deep football family. So I've started trying to explain things to her, and at times I get a little frustrated with, don't you understand kind of what's going on? I recently interviewed Rogers Redding, who's the NCAA rules coordinator. So he's the guy who, whenever people have complaints about the rules, they talk to him. And I asked him, what is your favorite example of a rule in football that embodies its complexity? And this is the one that he gave me, so please bear with me. Here's what the rule says. If live ball fouls by both teams are reported to the referee, the foul's offset and the down is repeated. But there are some exceptions. Exception 1, when there is a change in team possession during a down and the team last gaining possession had not fouled before last gaining possession, they may refuse offsetting fouls and thereby retain possession after the completion of the penalty for its foul. The second exception is when Team B's foul is governed by post-scrimmage kick rules, which is a whole other set of rules. Team B may refuse offsetting fouls and accept post-scrimmage kick enforcement. All right, so how many of you understood what it is that I said? How many of you watch football? Right, so you've probably seen this in motion, where on the same play, two different players, both teams get a penalty, and then you figure out these offsetting rules. So one of the things that football does really well through its complexity is that it layers all of these individual rule sets into this larger narrative arc, right? Michael Polanyi, he's a thinker, and he talks about this distinction between tacit knowledge and focal knowledge. And really, it's like if you're playing the piano, for example, and you focus on every single key, you won't be able to do it. But you put all that knowledge together, and then you end up being able to play a concerto, whatever it might be. Football is exactly like that, which is ironic, because we sort of think of football as being like a bro-y kind of, Budweiser sport, right? One of the most complex sports on the planet. So that gives us a good framework to think about board games, for example. So the beauty of sport is that we're able to appreciate this larger story that comes out of the complexity of the rules. This is a game called Puerto Rico, where you assume the roles of colonial governors on the island of Puerto Rico during the age of Caribbean ascendancy. The thing is, like, when you look at a game like this, that's not what you're thinking. But when you play a game like this, that's exactly what you're thinking. So let's try and think about, when we're thinking about board games in particular, let's think about rules and think about the power that rules have, particularly in a sporting context. Next up, so the next space that games engage us in is the mediated space, or the visual space. And this is actually the easiest one to explain. So this is one of my favorite painters. His name's Chuck Close. He's an American painter known for his photorealism. And he forces you, if you've ever seen a Chuck Close painting, they are enormous, and they force you to confront their monstrosity, but also their precision. This is how big the painting is, which works out really well. And you can get super, super close, and the detail is almost immaculate. What's really interesting is that Chuck Close, he suffers from a disease called prosopagnosia, which is also known as face blindness. So what that means is if you're talking to him and then you turn away, he will forget the person that you're talking to. And he became really obsessed with portraiture, because that was a way to remind him of what faces actually look like. And so what happens when you see a Chuck Close painting is you pull a story away, and you remember this story of seeing this beautiful, beautiful painting that was enormous. And that's the dialogue that you have with another person. You talk about whether, what was the technique that this person that Chuck Close used? How was he able to create brushstrokes so fine? Who is this person in the painting? All these questions arise from just sort of seeing this. We can do that for games as well. This is a screenshot from an actual game, kind of unbelievable. It's called Crisis 2. It's almost not even important what Crisis 2 is about. The point is that the way that people engage with a game like Crisis 2, I think often as spectators, is that we're drawn into this beauty. We want explanations about, how did they go about creating all of this, all this texture? And that can also be done through abstraction. I don't think games have to be photorealistic, but that's another way that we can really dialogue about games, what they look like. It seems very simple, but surprisingly, when you ask people what it's like to play a particular game, you describe it by what it's doing and not what it's looked like. So for those of you who have played Angry Birds, you probably talked about the pigs, and you probably didn't talk about the artwork. And I think that that's another way that we can sort of engage games. The third way is through the fictional space. This is from, how many of you have seen The Wire? Has anybody seen The Wire? It's one of my favorite shows on television, in part because David Simon is a former journalist, and the 5th season takes place in the Baltimore Sun, and it's clearly he has sour grapes and just tears that newspaper apart. It's a jilted journalist. He's like, I finally have more power than you now. Anybody who's left a job on bad terms, I'm sure, could appreciate that. So what's powerful about The Wire is David Simon's sense of reality, not surreality. The fact that everything in The Wire is totally broken, top to bottom. The education system, the political structure, the police force, the crime families, everything is broken. And what David Simon asks you to do is he wants you to come into this world and bring your own sets of assumptions about how things should work. And then he subverts them and changes them and disappoints you. Watching The Wire is a powerful experience, but it's a very disappointing one as well. You feel like things are not quite right. Things should kind of change, and he's always sort of playing with your expectations. So that's something that games can do really well, do really well as well. So the fictional space is one that people feel sort of comfortable talking about, and that games have sort of these stories. This is still from Red Dead Redemption, which was created by the makers of Grand Theft Auto. It takes place in the West. It's one of my favorite games of the last couple years, in part because you end up with pulling all these stories and you're given all of these opportunities through choice to really become your own person. So I'll give you an example. This is not me, by the way, but this relates to the story. In the game, you kind of have this big open Wild West setting, and you can do a bunch of different things, and you don't necessarily have to do them in the same order. And so I encountered this woman who clearly I thought was mentally ill. She sends me on a mission from God. And the idea is that I'm supposed to go capture and murder another person. And of course, because the game has asked me to do that, I go and do that. And so when I get back, she asks me if I've done it, and I say yes, and then she gives me money. And the game says, that's it. Your time with this woman has ended. But I felt so compelled that this woman has a mental illness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hog tie her and throw on the back of my horse, and I'm going to go down to the doctor's office, and I'm just going to leave her there because that's what makes sense to me. And that's what I would do is if I see someone who I think has mental illness, I'm going to take them to someone who can give them help. The game did not ask me to do that at all. I didn't get rewarded for it, nothing at all. But I felt like that was a powerful expression about who I was and what I wanted my character to be. And that's a story that I feel like I can compare with other people. People have lots of great stories about Red Dead Redemption. The fourth one is the play space. So this is, so play space that's just sort of kind of where you are, right? Where you are when you play a particular game. And it's one that's kind of reemerged over the last couple of years with things like the Wii and the Microsoft Kinect, which is a motion detecting camera. Play has actually become something of interest in the art world as well. This is a shot from my hometown. I live in New York City, and they've been renovating the High Line, which is an old tray line along the West Side Highway, and they asked this Miami-based design firm called Friends With You to build basically like an amusement park for adults. And the idea was to sort of capture the splendor and majesty of what it's like to be a kid. Because when you sort of forget that when you get older, like things sort of become the size that they actually are as you grow up. But the way you remember them was like, oh my gosh, that was enormous. So they wanted to recapture that. And the idea was, so let's build a playground for adults. Recently, so we have an office right behind the new museum, and Karsten Huller is an artist, and he put a 3-story slide through 3 floors of the museum. There was like a 2-hour wait to get on the thing. And so what he was doing was like he's subverting your expectations about what happens when you go to a museum. So it's commentary on the curatorial process, it's commentary on play, it's commentary on what you're supposed to be doing when you're at a museum. And there's a Ferris wheel actually upstairs, a merry-go-round as well. But so what Karsten Holler's doing is like he's taking the play space to the museum and then bringing his own opinions to bear, and then you're sort of left to walk away from them. I wrote it. It was awesome. I had to sign a waiver. I wore a helmet. So there obviously are some limitations. So play space is actually that's something what games do really well as well. So this is an image from a game that's now currently being housed at the Computerspiel Museum in Berlin. It's called Pain Station. It's a game of Pong. But you see, it's basically the game equivalent of like when you were a kid, you put your hands out and someone put your hands underneath and they try and fake you. If you fake someone out, you got to slap their hands. It's like that. So you're basically playing a game of Pong with your right hand, but your left hand is over a sensor that can either burn you, shock you, or whip you. And the intensity, however long, like you can continue to play Pong, and every time you mess up, the intensity of the punishment kind of ramps up. So it becomes this kind of game of chicken between you and this other person. Again, so the creator of this game making commentary on what our expectations are about play space. And anyone who's played this game, you walk away with like amazing stories. Like it's an epiphanal, life-changing experience. All right, the last one. So last one is the social space. And that's not the play, because you can have a play space and still be by yourself. But social space is something that you do with other people. And that's a place where games do things very, very well, right? Games, by definition, it's really interesting in the history of games that there are really only two single-player games, golf and solitaire, which I find fascinating because the term social games has become like Facebook games. I think it's definitely a bit of a misnomer simply because I think games by definition are social. So it's interesting we have to create this other little category that these games are more social than other types of games, which I think is totally wrong, and I can talk about that some other time. In any case, some of the great socializer in terms of thinking about social space are architects, and in this case, an artist. His name is Richard Serra. This was a piece called Tilted Arc. It was installed in 1981. It's 120 feet long, 12 feet high, installed in the Federal Plaza, costs about $150,000. It was, so the controversy of this piece is if you're on the left-hand side and you need to get to work, the last thing you want to do is walk around a 120-foot wall, right? It's like if you open the subway car doors and there's just like art right there in front of you. You'd be like, oh, dang it, yeah, this is beautiful and whatnot. So it actually became the subject of a court case that asked these questions about the role of government funding, the artist's rights to his or her work, the role of the public in determining the value of a work of art, and whether public art should be judged by its popularity. Richard Serra's point was that he wanted people to interact with this thing, that he as an artist wanted to make a statement that, when you look at something, it's not just a perspective of looking, but it's really interacting with this particular piece. And he had this famous quote where he said that art is not democratic, it's not for the people. But the point is that he was trying to create engagement about what he was creating. On a different note, I think games do this really well through games like Dance Central 2, which is one of my favorite games. For those of you who haven't played, it's for the Kinect. It's really cool. You basically just stand in front of the camera and it gives you dance moves and you follow them. The new version actually allows you to play with another person, which is really, really cool. But the game is specifically designed for you to play in front of other people. It's a little weird to kind of be standing in your home dancing by yourself. And the game designers know that. The point is that they wanted to create the same kind of dialogue. And similar questions about fairness actually arise from games like Dance Central 2. For example, the Kinect. If you were in a wheelchair, the Kinect is not great at picking up your movement. So how does how do we create questions of fairness around these types of games as well? I think one of the things that games do so well is when people talk about them, they say, I did that. No other medium does this. When you watch a movie, you read a book, you don't say, I was Iago. You don't do that, right? I was there. People would think that you're totally crazy. I'm winning an Academy Award this year. And people think you're totally nuts. But when you play games, you have this feeling that, wow, I was a part of this personal experience. And it's something that just belongs to me. So if I'm Nathan Drake, hunting for treasure, and I fend myself off against all odds, I talk about the fact that I did that. So these are our stories, and they're as real as anything that's ever happened to us. But if we don't tell that girl at the bar, the friend at the reunion, that coworker, then they just fade into the ether. There's a great quote from director Alejandro Jodorowsky, and he recently tweeted this. He said, "Si hablo, creo futuros, si callo, el presente es eterno." And that translates to, if I speak, I create futures. If I keep quiet, the present is eternal. Thank you very much.